The Night Round. The call came in at 6:30, just as the light was going out over the sky over Hollow Fen. Callum Ashworth was halfway through the tin of beans, television murmuring some quiz show he wasn't watching, when his phone buzzed against the arm of the sofa. He almost let it go to voicemail. It was a withheld number, and withheld numbers on a Tuesday evening were never anything good. Ashworth, he said, because that was how his father had always answered the phone, and old habits from a dead man have a way of outliving him. Callum, it's Reeves, from Kestrel Pharmacy Logistics. The voice was clipped, harried, and sound of someone standing in a car park with the wind picking up. Sorry to ring you at this hour. We've got a problem. Callum set the beans down. What kind of problem? Jeff hasn't shown for the night round. Not answering his phone, not answering the door, nothing. His wife's beside herself. We've got 14 drivers that have had to go out tonight. Proper time critical stuff. Insulin, palliative meds, that sort of thing. People who can't get to the chemist themselves. I know it's short notice, but you did your training back in March, and you're the only other driver signed off for the after-hours route. Callum had done the training, yes. 3 days shadowing Dref Pardew in the company's ancient transit van, learning the route that wound out past the edges of Hollow Fen and into the scattered villages beyond, where the streetlights gave up and the hedgerows pressed close to either side of the roads, barely wide enough for 2 cars. He had done it because the extra shifts paid well, and because, since his father's funeral, the flat had become a place he preferred not to be in on the evenings. I can do it, he said. Where do I collect? The depot, usual place. Sandra's opening up for you now. Callum, thank you. Genuinely, I owe you one. It's fine, Callum said, and it was, mostly. 14 houses. He could be home by midnight. The depot was a low brick building on the industrial estate outside town, sandwiched between the tyre place and a self-storage yard. Its sign faded to the colour of old teeth. Sandra, the night dispatcher, was waiting for him in the doorway with a clipboard and a peculiar look of a woman who was spent the last hour on the phone trying to locate a missing man. No word from Jeff then? Callum asked, taking the clipboard. Not a peep. His wife's gone round to check the house properly. Car's there, coat's there, but he isn't. Probably had one too many at the anchor and fallen asleep somewhere daft. Wouldn't be the first time, she responded. She didn't sound convinced by her own explanation, and Callum noticed she had had it too quickly. The way people do when they want to worry to be smaller than it is. The van was loaded already, a transit with the Kestrel Pharmacy Logistics stencilled on the side in blue, the paint chipped at the corners from years of low branches and narrow gateways. Callum climbed in and looked at the manifest. 14 stops. The addresses ran outward from the depot in a long loop that would take him through Hollow Fen proper, out along the river road to the scattered hamlets, Sedgwick, Marrow End, Cold Harbour, and back again at the Old Mill Road. He recognised perhaps half the names of the villages. The rest were the kind of places that existed on maps and nowhere else, single lanes with 3 houses and a phone box nobody used anymore. There's a route card in the glove box, Sandra said, leaning in at the window. Jeff always used it. Says it's easier than the sat-nav this way. Signal's rubbish. Just follow it in order. Don't skip about. Anything I should know? First time nervous and all that? Sandra hesitated, and for a moment something moved behind her eyes that Callum couldn't quite name. Not quite worry, not quite pity. Just be polite, she said. Some of these customers, they're old, they're poorly. They don't get many visitors. Jeff always said the round was as much about the knock on the door as what was in your hand when they open it. Be kind to them, that's all. That's all? That's all, she said again, too firmly, and stepped back from the window with that peculiar briskness of a woman closing the subject before it could be reopened. You'll be back by midnight if you keep moving. 14 stops, in order, don't linger. And Callum, she paused, one hand still resting on the wing mirror, and for a moment the brisk mask slipped and something older and more tired showed through underneath it. If the house seems like it wants you to stay longer than a knock and a handover, don't. Just don't. Say your piece, hand it over, and go on to the next. It's kinda that way, for everyone. He wanted to ask her what he meant by that, but she had already turned back toward the depot door, and the moment for asking had a way, he would come to learn, of closing itself the instant it opened, like a hand curling shut around something that had reached for a fraction too late. He told himself it was nothing, small town superstition, the sort of thing that accreated around the job that took a person out alone in the dark, the way sailors once swore by omens and miners refused to whistle underground. It struck him in an odd thing to say, the sort of instruction they'd give to a new nurse rather than a delivery driver, but he nodded and pocketed the route card without reading it properly and pulled off out of the depot yard into the night that was coming down fast and full of the strange, close warmth, as though a storm was building somewhere just out of sight. Though the sky above the industrial estate was clear all the way to a thin, cold moon. Number 4. Fenwick Row. The first house was in Hollow Fen itself, a terrace of narrow brick cottages built for mill workers 150 years before and never quite finished catching up with the century since. Number 4 had a black door with a brass knocker shaped like a fox's head and no light showing at any window, though it was not yet fully dark. Callum checked the package against the manifest, a small white box, standard prescription packaging, the patient's name printed on the label, E. Thorne. He knocked twice on the fox's head and waited. The door opened slowly, on a chain at first, then fully, and the woman who stood in the gap was not quite what he expected. She was perhaps 60, though it was hard to say. Her face had a strange stillness of someone who had stopped aging in a way most people do, all at once rather than by degrees. She wore a high-collared dress, dark grey, the sort of thing Callum had only seen in period dramas, buttoned to the throat, with long sleeves despite the mildness of the evening. Her hair was pinned up in a style he associated with photographs of his own great-grandmother. She looked at him with pale, unblinking eyes. "You're not Geoffrey," she said. Her voice had an odd, formal cadence, each word placed with care, as though English were a second language she had mastered long ago but never quite grown comfortable with. "No, sorry, Jeff couldn't make it tonight. I'm covering his round, Callum." He held out the package. "This is for E. Thorne?" "Eleanor," she said, as if correcting him, though he hadn't got it wrong. She took the box from him with both hands, cradling it the way one might hold something alive. "You have kind eyes." Geoffrey had kind eyes too. It was a good thing, in this line of work, to have kind eyes. "Right," Callum said, not sure what else to say. "Well, you have a good evening." "You as well," she said. "Mind the lane past Cold Harbour. It floods this time of year, though it hasn't rained." And she smiled at him, a small private smile, as though she had made a joke he wasn't clever enough to understand, and shut the door softly, and Callum heard the chain slide back on into place. He stood on the step a moment, longer than he needed to. There had been no rain in a week. He got back in the van and told himself, quite firmly, that some people were simply strange, and that eccentricity was not a crime, and that he had 13 more stops to make. The Old Rectory, Marrow End. The second house sat at the end of a long gravel drive on a river road, a square Georgian building with dark windows and an air of having been built for a family far larger than whoever lived there now. The package this time was for G. Halloway, and larger than the first, a padded envelope, the kind used for fragile items. An elderly man answered the door in a dressing gown, moving with the careful, listing gait of someone recovering from a stroke or something like one. His face sagged asymmetrically on one side, and when he spoke, the words came out thick and slow, as if his tongue no longer quite fit right in his mouth. "You're new," he said. "Filling in for Jeff tonight." The old man took the envelope and turned it over in his hands, studying it with the attention that seemed excessive for a simple prescription. "Geoffrey brings it Tuesdays and Fridays. Regular as church bells, Geoffrey. You'll be back to the usual driver next week, I expect." "I should think so, yes." The old man's eyes came up to meet his, and there was something in them, not malice, not quite, but a kind of weary, ancient patience, that a man watching a child play a game whose rules he understood far better than the child ever could. "You mustn't stop halfway through the round," he said. "Whatever you see, however strange it gets, you mustn't stop. It goes badly for the ones who stop." Callum laughed, a short, uncertain sound. "I'm not planning on stopping. No, just doing the deliveries, back home by midnight. That's the plan." "Good lad," the old man said, and there was something almost fond in it, the way you'd praise a dog for sitting nicely. He shut the door without saying good night, and Callum walked back to the van with a strange prickling sensation of being watched from an upstairs window, though when he looked up, the glass held nothing but the reflection of the moon. The third house was unremarkable. A woman in her 30s, perfectly ordinary, who thanked him distractedly and shut the door on a burst of television noise and a child crying somewhere inside. Callum felt his shoulders come down around his ears. There, he thought, normal people. Just an odd patch is all. Every job's got its characters. The fourth house restored none of that comfort. Cold Harbour Lane. He found the lane exactly where the route card said, exactly where the strange woman in the high collar had warned him it would flood, though the ground was bone dry and the ditches on either side held nothing but nettles and the husk of last year's reeds. The house was set back from the road behind a low wall, a squat stone cottage with a roof that sagged in the middle at the back of an old horse. The manifest read M. Pruitt, and the item was another small white box, but when Callum lifted it from the crate at the back of the van, he paused. It felt wrong in his hand, heavier than a prescription had any right to be, and cold, colder than the evening air would account for, as though it had come straight from a refrigerator. He carried it to the door anyway. What else was he to do? The man who opened the door was younger than the others, perhaps 40, and there was nothing outwardly strange about him until he smiled, and Callum saw that his teeth did not sit right in his gums, too many of them, crowded and grey, like a mouth trying to remember what teeth were supposed to look like and getting the general idea more than the specifics. "Ah," the man said. "New face. Lovely." He took the box and did not thank Callum, and did not say anything else at all, simply stood in the doorway holding it, watching Callum with an unhurried cataloguing interest, the way a man might watch an insect he is deciding whether to squish, until Callum found the silence had gone on for a beat too long and turned back to the van without quite meaning to run. He sat in the driver's seat for a full minute before he could make his hand stop shaking enough to turn the key. 14 stops, he told himself. You're on 4. 10 more and you're home. He thought, distantly, of the old man in the dressing gown. You mustn't stop halfway through the round. It goes badly for the ones who stop. He didn't know why that thought had surfaced now, or why it had settled into his chest like a stone dropped into a well, sinking down past the point where he could see it anymore, but not past the point where he could feel it was still there. Sedgwick. By the 5th house, the packages had changed. He noticed it when he opened the back doors of the van at a squat pebble-dash bungalow on the edge of Sedgwick, the sort of house that belonged to a street rather than a lane, ordinary in every way except from that it now shared a street with. The crate held white boxes still, standard delivery packaging with the pharmacy's blue logo on the side, but they were larger than before, and several of them had begun to faintly to smell. Not the sharp chemical smell of medicine, something else. Something with a wet, organic weight to it, sweetish and rotten underneath, the smell of a butcher's bin left out too long in summer. Callum stood in the open doors of the van for a long moment, the manifest trembling slightly in his hand, and told himself it was nothing, spoiled meds maybe, something that had gone off in the transit, nothing that was any of his business to investigate. He was not a pharmacist. He was a driver. His job was to knock on the door and was handing over the box, and nothing more than that. And if he started opening things that weren't his to open, he'd lose his job entirely, and then what? He told himself this all the way up the garden path, and it worked, mostly, right up until the door opened and he saw the woman who answered it. She had been beautiful once, he could see in the ghost of it on the bones of her face, but something had happened to her skin, a slack, waxen quality, as though it no longer quite fit the shape of what was underneath. Her left arm ended at the elbow in a stump wrapped in clean white bandage, recent, professional, the kind of dressing you'd get from a hospital rather than a home first aid kit. She looked at the box in Callum's hands with an expression of naked, aching hunger that he would spend the rest of his life trying not to remember, and did not remember succeeding. "Is it," she started, and her voice cracked, and she tried again. "Is it a good one this time?" Callum had no idea what to say to that. I I couldn't tell you, sorry. I just deliver. Of course, she said, quickly gathering herself, drawing the box against her chest with her one good arm. Of course, you're new. Geoffrey never asks either. He learned, same as I did, same as we all do. She looked up at him, and for a moment the hunger in her face gave way to something that might almost have been pity. It does get easier, the road I mean. Not the rest of it, but the road, yes, that part gets easier. She shut the door and Callum walked back to the van on legs that he did not entirely feel like his own, and sat there for a while in the driver's seat with the engine off, staring at the dashboard clock, watching the minutes turn over. 9 stops left. He should have turned back then. He knew it, even as he sat there. Some old animal part of his brain screaming at him in a language beneath words that the correct and sane thing to do was to drive back to the depot and hand Sandra the keys, and never think about Hollow Fen's back lanes again as long as he lived. But there was the old man's voice in his head, warm and heavy as a held door. It goes badly for the ones who stop. And there was Sandra's voice too, from what he felt now like a different lifetime, standing in the depot yard. Be kind to them, that's all. And underneath both of those, something simpler and more shameful. The fact that he did not know how to get home from here without the route card, and lanes would have folded into themselves in the dark until he could no longer say with any confidence which turning led back toward the town and which led further out into whatever this was. He turned the key, the engine caught, and he drove on. The turning. What followed blurred together in his memory afterward into a single long smear of headlights and hedgerows, and doors opening onto faces that had stopped, by degrees, being faces at all. At a farmhouse past Marrow End, he delivered a box to a man whose jaw had been replaced. There was no other word for it, with something that did not sit right against his skull, too wide, hinged wrong, so that when he spoke to thank Callum the words came off slightly out of time, like a badly dubbed film. At a cottage with the collapsed thatch roof, he handed a parcel to a figure so tall it had to stoop through its own doorway, its limbs too long for its torso in a way that made Callum's eyes want to slide away from it entirely, the way you look away from the sun. The boxes themselves had stopped pretending. By the 9th stop he no longer needed to guess at what was inside them. The shapes pressed against the cardboard with an unmistakable, terrible specificity, and the smell had become a constant companion in the back of the van, thick enough now that he drove with the windows of it down despite the cold, gulping at the night air between houses like a man surfacing from a deep water. He did not open a single box. He understood, without anyone telling him so directly, that this was the one rule that could never be broken, that his job, his only job, was the carrying and the knocking and the handing over, and that whatever came after the door closed was no longer his to know. It was, he thought once, in a brief flash of black humour that frightened him more than anything else had that night, rather like being a waiter. You did not ask what the kitchen had done to the meal, you simply carried the plate. The recipients grew stranger with each stop, and stranger too, in a way that felt cumulative, as though something in them was being built up, delivery by delivery, box by box, the way a shape emerges from clay under the sculptor's hands. He began to understand, somewhere in the cold, functioning part of his mind that was still capable of understanding things, that what he was delivering and what was opening the doors were connected, that the boxes were not medicine at all, or not only medicine, that something in this string of houses along these old lanes was being fed and rebuilt, and made whole by pieces that did not belong to them, and that his van was simply the vessel by which these pieces travelled from wherever they came from to wherever they were needed. At a caravan parked crookedly in what had once been a farmyard, its windows papered over from the inside with what looked, in the torchlight, like pages torn from a hymnal, a child's voice thanked him from the parcel in a register 2 octaves too low for a small, stooped shape that took it from his hands, and Callum found he could not, afterward, remember whether the shape had found a face at all, only that something about its posture had suggested gratitude, or the memory of what gratitude had once meant to look like. At a house with no number, tucked between two proper addresses, as though the street itself had grown an extra tooth to make room for it, a woman received her box through the gap in the door, no wider than a letterbox, 2 fingers, too many of them, jointed in the wrong places, with nails grown long and yellow as a horn, closing around the parcel with tenderness that turned his stomach more than any violence could have done. He began, somewhere around the 10th or 11th stop, to notice that he had stopped flinching, not because the horror had lessened, but because part of him had quietly, grimly, decided that flinching cost more than it earned, and he had put the reflex away for safekeeping, the way you might set down a heavy bag you no longer had the strength to carry and still walk. At the 12th house, a low black building that might once have been a chapel, its windows boarded, its door hanging slightly open before he'd even knocked. The thing that took the box from him had 4 arms, jointed wrong at the elbow, arranged around a torso wrapped in what looked, in the poor light of his phone torch, like grave linen gone soft and grey with age. It did not speak. It simply took the parcel, turned, and folded itself back into the darkness of the doorway, and Callum stood in the step, with his heart going so hard he could feel it in his teeth, and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, I am going to die tonight, one way or another. The only question is whether it happens on this step or somewhere further down the road. He chose the road. He always chose the road. 13 stops then, and 1 to go. The 13th house. The lane to the 13th house was narrower than any he had come before, hemmed so close by hawthorn hedge that the wing mirrors of the van brushed leaves on both sides at once, and it seemed to Callum, in the strange dreamlike logic that had settled over the whole night, that the hedges themselves were pressing inward, funneling him towards something rather than simply growing where they had always grown. The house at the end had its no proper shape that he could make sense of. It seemed, in the headlights, to shift very slightly as he approached, the roofline not settling into a fixed silhouette until he had almost stopped the van, as though the building had been unsure, up until the last moment, what it wanted to look like tonight. The box for this address was the worst yet, heavy in both hands, wrapped in brown paper that had gone dark and damp in one corner, the smell so overwhelming that Callum had to breathe through his mouth to keep from being sick on the doorstep. His hands were shaking badly now, had been shaking for several stops, but he'd made himself knock, because the alternative, turning around, driving away, becoming the second driver in one night to simply vanish for this round, felt, in some way he could not fully articulate, far more dangerous than knocking ever could. The door opened before his knuckles had properly finished the second knock, as though something behind it had been standing there, waiting, for rather longer than he was comfortable to think about. What answered had no face that Callum's mind was willing to render as a face. There was a suggestion of features, the memory of where eyes and mouth ought to sit, but the flesh between had gone soft and unfixed, sliding very slowly, very slightly, the way wax slides down the side of a candle that has burned too long in the draught. It did not speak. It made a sound instead, low and wet, that might once have been a word, in a mouth that might once have been known to shape one. And it reached the box with its hands that had too many joints in each finger and took it from him, and Callum turned and walked back to the van without looking back, because he understood, in the same cold, functioning place of his mind, that if he looked back he would see it open the box on the doorstep, and that there were some things a man could carry for the rest of his life and some things he could not, and he did not intend to find out which category that particular sight belonged to. He sat in the van for a long time before he trusted his hands enough to drive. 1 left, he told himself, and the words felt thin and useless against the shape of everything that had happened. But he made himself hold on to it anyway, the way you would onto a rope in deep water, even after your arms have stopped believing it will help. 1 left, and then home. He did not, in that moment, let himself wonder what home would look like to him after tonight, whether it would still feel like a place he belonged, whether he would ever again be able to hear a knock on his own door without his stomach turning over. He simply drove, following the last line of the route card, out past Cold Harbour and along a stretch of road that he did not remember from the outbound journey. though the lanes had stopped some hours ago, obeying any geography he recognised. The last house. The change, when it came, was so complete and so abrupt that Callum very nearly drove past the final address without recognising it as the end of anything at all. The lane widened. The hedgerows fell back, neatly trimmed, ordinary, the kind of hedge a man keeps because he likes his garden to look tidy, rather than because it was holding something in or out. Streetlights returned. Proper orange sodium streetlights. The sort Hallow Fen itself had. The sort that belonged to the world Callum had left behind hours ago without quite noticing the moment of leaving. And there, at the end of a short paved drive, sat a house so extraordinarily, so almost aggressively normal that it took Callum a full minute of sitting in the van to trust his eyes weren't lying to him. It was a 1930 semi, pebble-dashed, with a neat privet hedge and a rose bed under the front window and a car. An ordinary silver hatchback, nothing more sinister than a few years old, parked in the drive. A porch light burned warm and yellow above the front door. Somewhere inside, faintly, Callum could hear the sound of a radio playing something classical, and underneath it, a particular clunk and shuffle of someone doing the washing up. The manifest read, in Sandra's neat printing, "R. Whitcomb, final stop." The package on the passenger seat beside him was, and Callum checked this 3 times, turning it over in his shaking hands under the dome light before he trusted himself to believe it, an ordinary white pharmacy box. Light, dry, no smell but the faint, clean, papery smell of cardboard and printed labels. Blood pressure tablets, the label said, in a perfectly legible dosage, for a perfectly plausible complaint. He walked up the path with the box held against his chest, like something he was afraid of dropping, though there was nothing now to be afraid of dropping it, and knocking on the door with the brass letterbox and a welcome mat gone soft and faded for years of ordinary feet wiping ordinary shoes on it, and waited. The man who opened the door was, Callum thought afterward, the single most normal-looking human he had ever seen in his life. And it was this, more than anything that had come before it, more than the 4-armed thing in the chapel doorways or the sliding wax face of the 13th house that made the fine hairs stand upon his arms. He was perhaps 70, silver-haired, neatly combed, dressed in a cardigan the colour of weak tea over a checked shirt, with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a towel still in one of his hands, as though he had been interrupted mid-jaw. His face was kind of in an unremarkable way of a favourite uncle, lined with the sort of laughter creases that sum from decades of easy good humour, and his eyes, when they met Callum's, were perfectly ordinary shade of blue, warm and clear, and entirely, devastatingly sane. "You must be Callum," he said, and his voice was pleasant, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be heard. "Come in out of the cold a moment. You look like you could do with sitting down." I'm all right, thank you. I should probably," Callum heard himself say, and did not entirely believe the words as they left his mouth. "Nonsense," the old man said, not unkindly, and stepped back from the door to let the light and the warmth and the radio washing up sound of the house spill out onto the step. "Just for a minute. You've had a long night, and I think you've earned a sit-down, don't you?" Callum went in. He would ask himself many times over the months that followed why he had gone in, whether it was a courtesy, an exhaustion, or simply the animal, unthinking relief of finding one ordinary room at the end of a night that contained nothing ordinary at all, and he would never fully settle on the answer. The hallway was papered in faded rose pattern, hung with photographs in dark wood frames. A woman who might have been a wife, smiling on a bench somewhere with the wind in her hair. A dog, some sort of spaniel, sitting proudly on a garden path. A group of grandchildren squinting up at the sun outside on what looked like this very house. It was, in every visible particular, the hallway of a comfortable, unremarkable, well-loved life. The kitchen, where the old man had led him, was warm from the oven and smelled of something baking, a fruit cake, Callum thought, though his mind at this point had very little confidence left in its own observations. There were 2 mugs already set out on the counter, as though the old man had known, somehow, exactly when Callum would arrive, and the kettle was already sighing its way toward the boil. "Sit down," the old man said again, gesturing at a chair in the small kitchen table, and Callum sat, because his legs, when it came to it, could not offer him so much choice in the matter. "You'll want to know what this is," the old man said, setting a mug of tea in front of him, strong, milky, exactly the way Callum took it, though he had not asked. "What you've been carrying tonight, what you've been carrying it through." "I don't," Callum's voice came out cracked, and he tried again. "I don't think I want to know, actually. I think I'd rather just finish up and go home, if that's all right." The old man smiled, and there was such genuine, uncomplicated sympathy in it that Callum felt, absurdly, his eyes sting. "That's a very sensible instinct," he said, "and ordinarily I'd let a man keep it. But I'm afraid this last one you do need to hear, because it concerns you rather than more directly than the others." He sat down across the table, folding his hands around his own mug, an old man's hands, spotted and dry and perfectly steady. "This is your round now, Callum. Geoffrey has finished this. You'll be doing this route from now on, Tuesdays and Fridays, same as him, out along the lanes, the same 14 houses, give or take, as they come and go. It isn't the sort of job you can go hand back once you've started it. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you'd have chosen, given the choice." Callum stared at him. Something in his chest had gone very cold and very still, the way water goes still just before it freezes. "Jeff didn't finish anything," he said, though even as he said it he understood, with a sick, sliding certainty, exactly what the word meant in this kitchen, from this man's mouth. "Jeff's missing. His wife's worried sick. He hasn't. He did the round for 11 years, the old man said gently, as though this answered the question, and in its way, Callum understood. It did. 11 years is a good long run, longer than most. It takes something out of a man, doing this, carrying what needs carrying, night after night, out to the ones who are owed it, and to the ones who are owing. Sooner or later, every driver reaches the point where they can't do it anymore, where the road stops giving anything back, and when that happens, he spread his hands, a small, apologetic gesture, the gesture of a man explaining an unfortunate but unavoidable point of policy. Well, when that happens, this is where the round ends for him too, this last house, this last delivery. Only the parcel, on that particular night, isn't in the box at all. The kitchen was very quiet. The radio had stopped, or perhaps Callum simply could no longer hear it over the sound of his own pulse. "You're telling me," he said, very carefully, as though the words themselves might shatter if he moved too quickly, "that when I can't do this anymore, you'll be here, waiting, and I'll be the delivery." "That's right," the old man said, with the same warm, patient kindness he might have used to confirm a bus timetable. "There's no cruelty in it, whatever it might sound like. It isn't a punishment. It's simply the shape of an arrangement, what's carried and what's owed for the carrying. You'll find, I think, that the years in between needn't be unhappy ones. Geoffrey wasn't unhappy most of the time. He had his wife, his garden, his Tuesdays and Fridays. He knew what waited at the end of the road, same as you now know it, and he made his peace with it, in his own way, same as every driver does eventually. It's rather easier, I find, once a man stops fighting the knowing of it." He reached across the table, and with a gentleness that Callum would remember for the rest of whatever years were left to him, patted the back of his hand, a grandfather's gesture, warm and dry and entirely without menace. "You did well tonight, every knock, every door, all the way to the end without turning back. That matters more than you know. Now finish your tea and go home, sleep if you can. Sandra will have your Tuesday manifest ready. You needn't come back here again until the day you do." Callum did not remember afterward finishing the tea, or standing, or walking back down the rose-papered hallway past the photographs of the smiling woman and the spaniel and the squinting grandchildren. He remembered the porch light, warm and yellow, and the old man's voice behind him, unhurried and kind, saying, "Mind how you go now. in that exact tone a favourite uncle might use to a nephew after a Sunday lunch. He remembered the ordinary silver hatchback on the ordinary drive, and the ordinary privet hedge, and the ordinary orange streetlights all the way back down the lane he had, somewhere in the space of that visit, quietly rejoined the roads that he knew. He drove home in a silence broken only by the thick of the cooling engine, and once a sound which might have been a sob or might have been a laugh, and he did not examine too closely which. Epilogue. Jeff Pardew's disappearance made the local paper for 1 week, and then it didn't. His wife moved away in the spring to be nearer her sister, and the house on the edge of Hallow Fen with the neat garden and the empty drive was sold to a young couple who had never asked, and were never told, what had become of the previous owner. Callum still does the night round, Tuesdays and Fridays, same as before, out past Cold Harbour and Sedgwick and Marrow End, the same 14 houses, give or take, as they come and go. For it is true, he has found, that they do come and go. That a name that was on the manifest last spring is sometimes simply absent by autumn, and he has learned not to ask Sandra where they went, in the same way he has learned not to ask what, precisely, is inside the boxes that have been stopped, by degrees smelling of anything but cardboard and print. He has a house now of his own, a small one, with a garden that he had started, in a tentative way, to take some pride in. He was not unhappy most of the time. He has found, as the old man promised him he would, the first terrible night, patting the back of his hand across the kitchen table that smelled of fruit cake and strong tea, that it is rather easier once a man stops fighting than knowing of it. He has trained a new driver, too, once or twice, when the ordinary daytime rounds have needed covering, and Kestrel Pharmacy Logistics has found itself short-handed. Young men and women glad for the extra hours, who ask him, over the handover, what the night route past Cold Harbour is like, since he's the one who knows it best now. He tells them it's a quiet run, long lanes, poor signal, elderly customers who appreciate a friendly face. He tells them to follow the route card in order not to skip about, and to be kind, because the round is as much about a knock on the door as what's in your hand when it opens. He has never told any of them the whole of it, and he has come to slowly to understand why Sandra never told him, that the knowledge is a kindness withheld rather than a kindness given, and that a man walks easier into the first night not knowing what waits at the end of the 14th drive. There is a woman in Fenwick Row who still delivers on the alternative Tuesdays, dressed always in the same high-collared grey, who tells him, every time, to mind the lane past Cold Harbour, though it has never once flooded in all the months he has known her. He has stopped correcting her. There are things, he has learned, that are kinder to simply let stand. But on Tuesday and Friday evenings, as the light goes out in the sky over Hollow Fen, and he loads the van in the cold blue dusk of the depot yard, he finds himself, every single time, glancing towards the far end of the route card, toward the 14th address, the pebble-dashed semi with the privet hedge and the porch light burning warm and yellow above the door, and he wonders, with the small, cold, private wonder that has told no one and never will, how many deliveries he has left in him, and whether, on the night he finally cannot face another knock, another door, another face gone soft, and a strange light of the torch, whether the old man will still be standing in the kitchen, with the kettle already sighing toward the boil, 2 mugs already set out on the counter, one of them, at last, for him.